The Fayetteville River Monster. Over the years, we've heard and read about a variety of cryptid sightings in Fayette County, Pennsylvania, which includes a supposed underwater beast in the Cheat River known as Monster of Seltzer Soul. The Cheat River is a 78-mile-long tributary of the Monongahela River. The following account appeared in the Philadelphia Times on July 31st, 1893. For months past, farmers living near the Line Ferry have been missing sheep, lambs, pigs, and even young calves, to say nothing of innumerable chickens, turkeys, and geese. And until a few days ago, they all blamed the Italians and other laborers engaged in grading the state line road with stealing the animals. Not a night since early last spring has passed without some farmer waked up in the morning to find that he had been robbed of a fat pig, a young calf, a sheep, 2 or 3 choice lambs, or half a dozen of his finest barnyard fowls. Effort was made to catch the thief, but every attempt proved a failure, and everybody had settled down to the belief that the laborers along the railroad were doing the stealing. But the mystery has at last been cleared up to the minds of at least 3 of the most reputable farmers of the neighborhood. They will not at present allow their names to be made public, and it was only after assuring the correspondent to keep their names out of print that they told him what they knew about this Monster of Seltzer Soul, as it's called. They each saw the monster on different occasions, but at about the same hour in the morning, and gave about the same description of it. "I first saw the monster," said one of the farmers. "Just at daybreak last Tuesday morning, I got up very early to go to Uniontown and started out to the pasture field to get the horses. And just as I opened the barnyard gate, I heard a terrible racket down by the calf pen, which was immediately followed by the stampede of every living object in the barnyard in the direction of the house. The chickens and turkeys flew with loud cries of distress into the trees in the yard and to the roof of the house, and all the cattle and pigs crowded around me, trembling with fright and utter pitiful outcries of terror. Something down at the calf pen had given them a terrible fright, but what it was I could not imagine. But I resolved to find out, and pushing my way through the trembling animals, I started down to the calf pen. When I got within 20 yards of the pen, the most horrible-looking monster the mind could conceive clambered over the strong rail fence that surrounds the calf pen, carrying in its mouth a 3-day-old calf. I tried to turn and fly to the house for protection, but if the monster had been within a foot of me, I could not have moved an inch. I tried to cry out, but not a sound escaped my lips. My tongue seemed to be made out of lead, and my eyes were fixed on the awful-looking creature that was slowly moving off toward the river, still carrying in its mouth the calf it had stolen. It looked to me to be the size of an Alderney cow, although its legs were very much shorter, and its body was somewhat longer. Its back was ridged and humped in the center, and from behind each shoulder protruded something which was neither a wing, fin, arm or claw, though it resembled each of them. Its tail was long and thick, and resembled that of a crocodile, except that the end was forked, resembling that of a monstrous fish. Its feet were webbed and resembled those of a bear in outline, and were as large as a peck measure. The body was covered with big, heavy scales, which moved as the monster walked. But the head of the dragon was the most fearful-looking part of all. It was as large as that of a horse, and covered with large, warty knots. Directly in the forehead and just below the eyes was a monstrous, jagged horn-like protuberance, and just back of the ears were 2 similar-looking horns, though somewhat smaller. The eyes were as large as a teacup and stuck out from their sockets at least 1.5 inches. The mouth of the beast I could not see very well, for the struggling calf was in it. But it must have been exceedingly large, for the monstrous jaws reached almost across the calf's body. The monster had traveled at least 100 yards toward the river before I recovered sufficiently to move. I was not asleep, but as wide awake as I ever was in my life. I resolved to follow the monster at a safe distance and see where it went. Rushing into the house, I seized my double-barreled shotgun, and without waking the rest of the family, I started after the ugly beast, and again caught sight of it just as it reached a clump of bushes on the cliff which overhangs the river near Line Ferry. It was broad daylight by this time, and with both barrels of my gun cocked, I followed in the monster's wake. When I reached the cliff, I looked down over it and saw the monster just crossing the road and making for the big rock in the water's edge alongside Seltzer Soul. It turned around when it reached the river bank and glared back at me. And then, with something between a growl and a bellow, it leaped into the water and disappeared from sight. I went down to the bank and watched for sight of the monster for over an hour. But as it did not show itself again, I went home. I did not tell my folks what I had seen, but simply said that somebody or something had stolen one of the calves during the night. Neither did I say anything about it to any of the neighbors until this morning. I knew they would not believe me and might start a report that I was going crazy. But this morning my neighbor came over to my house, and after fidgeting about for over an hour or two, took me out to the barn and said that he was bound to tell me something. After swearing me to secrecy, he told me that the monster that I had seen on Tuesday morning, for it was evidently the same one, had carried off one of his finest sheep this morning, and that he had followed it to Seltzer Soul, where it disappeared in the river. My neighbor and I then went up to our other neighbor and told him what we had seen, and he told us he had seen it twice last week, but was afraid to tell anyone about it, for the fear they would not believe him. I can't imagine what kind of animal it can be or how it came to be in Seltzer's hole. We are going to keep a lookout for the monster tonight, and if he comes out, we'll try to give him a good dose of buckshot. A number of people of the neighborhood have reported that they have seen a strange-looking beast at night on the hills near Cheat Haven during the past 3 months. But no one paid any attention to the stories, thinking them to be the creature of an imaginative brain. But if the word of the 3 farmers referred to can be believed, the reports are true. Seth's sea monster story. Back in the summer of 2014, I used to live in Oregon. Nina, my wife's friend husband John, owned a nice-sized boat that he had docked in one of the coastal towns. Having lived there a couple of years, while only going to the coast twice the entire time, when we were offered a ride on it one summer day, we agreed. I had never been on a boat, and I have always wanted to know what it was like to sail on the sea. I used to live in the deserts of Arizona, so living close to the sea was a real treat for me. Add to that the lush green of the state and the many forests it has, and I was awestruck. I never used to see that much green in Arizona. Granted, it rained all the damn time, it seemed. And it did get pretty cold. After all, where I lived was only a few miles from the halfway point between the Arctic and the equator. But it was a small price to me to live in such beauty. Plus, the no sales tax the state had didn't hurt the case either. Well, the day of the trip I was excited. We lived maybe 3 hours from where they lived, so we headed out early. It was 10 in the morning when we arrived. The summer air was in full swing and the ocean was breathing salty. It wasn't as hot as one might expect in the summer, but it was pretty warm. We went over to the oceanside property and spent the rest of the morning and part of the afternoon hitting the shops and eating at one of the seafood restaurants. We then went back to their place to chill for a bit before we headed out to the dock. By then it was almost 5 in the afternoon, and the dock was part empty, probably because a lot of people had the same idea we had. When I first laid eyes on the SS Seafarer, I was stunned. Now, to me, this was a majestic beast. To John, it was a black cove. He had it since 2013, and he loved its roomy deck and single-engine prowess. I was in awe, though. I was excited to get on it. He gave me a tour of his beast before we set sail out into the Pacific. We sailed out far enough that we lost sight of land. He knew the sea well and knew where the international water were. After a bit of sailing, of which he let me take the helm, we stopped and looked out into the empty vastness, which is the Pacific Ocean. There he produced a cooler with drinks, and we sat on the deck and talked for hours. The change in temperature was noticeable, and when the sun set after 9 p.m., we had brought coats and sweaters as they had instructed, as they knew it would get a bit chilly. The moon was out, but it wasn't real bright. We stayed another hour talking and not thinking about the problems in the world or in our life for the moment. I was the first who heard a sound emanating from the Pacific waters. It was like a soft howl, but low enough that the others didn't seem to notice it. I heard it though, and began wondering what it could be. I was excited at the thought that it could be a whale. After a while, it did it again, only slightly louder. This time the others heard it as well. My wife looked around and asked what it was. Nina said she didn't know, and John began actively listen as I was. After a few minutes, the sound was heard again. This time, instead of a howl, it sounded more like a growl. I started to suspect that it wasn't a whale, and asked John if he had heard anything like that before. He said no. It got quiet again for a few minutes. My wife and Nina started to talk again when we heard a large splash, which sounded way off, but was loud enough for us to hear it. John said if it was a whale, the biggest one we got, and it did that in the distance, it still wouldn't have been that loud. The air suddenly turned foul and rancid. It was a horrible, putrid smell, like rotting fish and ass mixed with the salty air. My wife threw up, while I held down the best I could. Then we heard the loudest growl I've ever heard. This was loud, and it echoed through the air. Then we heard another loud splash. That's when John decided it was high time to get the hell out of here. As he raced to the helm to start the beast up, we heard a growl again. Only this time it echoed from under the water. As he started the engine, the boat rocked suddenly back and forth, as if a sudden wave had hit us. Once started, he tried to pull forward. We moved, then suddenly stopped. John pulled forward again, and then suddenly stopped. We weren't moving. He did pull forward again, this time increasing speed. We didn't move an inch. I think it dawned on John and I at the same time that something was holding the boat. John let off speed and stopped it altogether. We all realized in horror at the same time that the boat was starting to move on its own, out farther into the sea. John immediately started moving forward again. Then he reversed it, and then pulled forward again. This time we felt a jerk. Something was indeed holding on to the boat. He reversed again, and then pulled forward. This time it jerked, followed by what sounded like a screech coming from underwater. John did this again and again. The final time, he broke free. As he sped off, we heard a splash, followed by the loudest screeching roar I have ever heard. This too echoed through the air. We made it back to the dock, tired and exhausted, but most of all, relieved to be back on land. We drove back to their place, where we stayed the night in the guest room. The next morning, we discussed what happened over breakfast. John and I agreed that it was a sea monster of some sort. The girls weren't sure what it was, but didn't want to say it was a sea monster. John and I decided to head back to the dock that day. He wanted to inspect his boat. Seeing as it was dark out and the moon wasn't bright enough to really see anything. After noticing nothing around the boat, he decided to check under it. He pulled out a swimsuit and a breathing tank, and jumped in. He was under there for a few minutes before he surfaced. As I helped him up, I noticed he looked a little shaken. When I asked him what was wrong, he looked at me with frightened eyes. He said that whatever it was out there, it must have been big. When he checked the bottom, he noticed indentations on it, as if something had grabbed onto it hard. And it was on both sides of the boat and ran the length of it. And he said that the propeller blades had bits of meat around it, which meant that when he broke free, he cut the thing in the process.